Yeah, I'm pretty much getting forced to say something about well, Zionism, because part of this backlash of the Christchurch shooting is the we've had the lone killer who acted alone, but he had secret accomplices somewhere, and now there's the hunt for the accomplices, which is yeah, pretty standard stuff for the CIA, but they keep on. They started pinning the Christchurch shooting on neo-Nazis. Now, I mean, before 9/11, 2001, and just after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a great revival, of blaming what turned out to be staged deep state events, mass murders and shootings and things. There was a great big rash of all these things being blamed on some kind of neo-Nazi. And they used a lot of movies like Romper Stomper to invent this idea in people's heads. And like the Port Arthur shooting was in many ways like the Australian version of the Oklahoma bombing, which was blamed on some shadowy group, paramilitary group somewhere, Michigan militia, and that was all a fraud. But anyway, this brings me to why now, because talking of politics from 80 years ago, at least, I mean, I don't usually follow internet conspiracy theories about numerology and that sort of thing, and numerology of dates, but it's interesting to note that the Communist Manifesto was published in 1848. And Karl Marx is regarded as this great prophet of sociology, politics and economics and history. Now, and I mean, the history of Bolshevism worldwide was very much a Jewish movement. I mean, all the Bolsheviks were Jews, with very rare exceptions. Now, you see, Bolshevism is regarded as like this savior of the Jewish people. And I mean, it's even George Orwell's sort of satire of what he called oligarchical collectivism in the fictional book by Emmanuel Goldstein. But it's a farce. But the thing is, I mean, communists, it's funny, you run into like Marxists still, they're not very, you don't see them that frequently, but you run into Marxists, and whenever something happens, like an economic crash or something, they look at each other and they go, yes, Karl Marx said this would happen. And well, you could argue that there's been an international plan to culminate, to seize more and more control of the world for Jewish Bolsheviks, and then to culminated by the control of Israel and the building a new temple in Jerusalem. Now, so in 1948, 100 years after the publication of the Communist Manifesto, you see the establishment of the State of Israel. Now, there's a famous Balfour Declaration. But the facts are communism and Marxism were very popular and coddled movements by the Anglo-American establishment. I mean, throughout the history, there was always this history of, a great deal of interoperation and funding and support for Bolsheviks from European and American industrialists. Anyway, we get to this thing where there's this analogy drawn. In fact, one of the raisons d'etre of the State of Israel is this application of Old Testament prophecy, where in 586 BC, the Jewish temple, the Israelite temple in Israel was destroyed by the Babylonians, and the people were taken captive in exile for 70 years in Babylon. And then there was Cyrus the Great, his declaration, and in the meantime, and lots of the Jews started returning to the land. And this is the story of this is told in the books of Nehemiah and Ezra. Now, the return of Jews to Israel is sold unabashedly and explicitly and vigorously. It's sold as a fulfillment of prophecy by Zionist Jewish supporters of Israel. Now, the thing is, it's a bit of a mix-up, because we're talking about Jews, literal Jews, moving from a metaphorical Babylon somewhere to a literal Israel. Now there's supposed to be, one imagines, we're told that there's a prophetic timetable, much like it's like a repetition of history. The 586, the temple is destroyed. 516 BC, it's rebuilt. In 539, the Jews return to the land. 24 years later, the temple's rebuilt. Oddly enough, at the Nuremberg trial, the execution of prominent Nazis at the Nuremberg executions in 1946, oddly enough, Julius Streicher, who was significant, he on the gallows, he said some things, and he actually said something, a cryptic phrase, Purim Fest 1946. Now this is interesting because this is 1946 and not 1948. So he had some idea that there was some application, there's some kind of apocalypse now. There was this hermeneutic, this idea of world politics, there being the return to Israel, the re-establishment of the new temple, the people in the land, and So even the senior Nazis were aware of this program being carried out by the Allies. Now, ironically, 1948, 2 years later, the State of Israel was established. Now, so the problem with that is because the Zionists drew so heavily on an interpretation of the Bible prophecy, they were under pressure to, you would have thought, if they're repeating history, they have got some kind of historical, some kind of prophetic timetable. Now, it's interesting to note that in 1948, 24 years after 1948, is 1972. So, it seems to me that what happened was the Arabs, the Arab countries, Syria and Jordan and Egypt, in 1972 realized that 24 years after the Jews had returned to the land, there was still no temple. And in 1973, that's when the OPEC, which is made up largely of Muslim countries, started the oil shock of the 70s, and they started driving up the price of oil to bankrupt America and Europe, which was basically what it did. So, and furthermore, in 1973, with Soviet help, the Jordanians and the Syrians and the Egyptians all attacked Israel all at once. That was the 73 war. And well, the Israelis prevailed, basically because they had better military equipment. But the thing is, one of these prophetic dates came due, and there wasn't a new temple. No, 73 came and went, and 74, 75, and everyone turned on the Jews. Everyone turned on the Israelis. Jimmy Carter instituted the Camp David peace process, and basically forced Israelis to give back all the stuff they'd captured, like Golan Heights and Sinai and everything. And of course the West Bank was a real issue. But because it's like when a cult leader, a leader of a cult, like declares that the world's going to end tomorrow or something, or on this date the world will end, and all the members of the cult believe him, and this actually happened, like I said before many times, but this actually happened, strange enough, it was 1844, I think, the Millerites. I think Charles Taze Russell was involved. The Millerites had this prophecy about 1844, and they had on the day when Jesus was supposed to return, they all went up on the roofs, and they had robes made out of bed sheets, and they stood up all night on the roof, waiting for the last trump. Now, it's pretty bad. I mean, the average, a lot of cults don't survive. I mean, there's the people who've predicted the end of the world and not been correct, and a lot of there's a credibility crunch, like a disastrous credibility crunch that swiftly follows a loss of confidence in the leader. Now, the strange thing is, you would have thought that would have been the end of the line for the Millerites. Something so stupid, and would have, we would have thought it would have unmasked the leadership as just a bunch of frauds. But strangely enough, one way or another, the Millerite movement split into three branches that are with us today, like the Branch Davidians, like David Koresh and all that, and the Seventh-day Adventists, and yeah, the Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, it's strange how these movements seem to survive such a disastrous loss of prestige. But it's a good example of how Zionism has been quite robust in that, you know, they get these rabbis all put their heads together and say, well, you know, a majority of scholars says that we've consulted the Torah and the rabbis, and you know, the temple will be rebuilt 24 years after the people return. 24 years goes by, and yeah, 1972, there's no new temple, and it's just a kind of a loss of prestige. Now, I mean, I think what happened was, obviously what happened, the rabbis got together and said, well, 24 years was wrong, we'll say 40 years. It's 40 years from the establishment of the State of Israel, 40 years. You know, 39 minus 40 gives you, yes, gives you like, it's 40 years, you know, like Elijah and all that. Yeah, so 40 years after the establishment of the State of Israel, what happened? The Soviet Union collapsed, basically. Like 1988 was the year when the Soviet Union and world communism started to crumble. And by the by the early 90s, Yeltsin was in power and the communists were out, and and all the remaining communists were forced out of Russia, basically, and then they ended up in the West. And you'd meet a lot of them, especially you run into millions of ex-Russian scientists and all working in provincial universities in America and Australia. Anyway, you see, I mean, the military-industrial complex, its propaganda before the fall of the Soviet Union was basically on the communist threat. The whole, the defense budget was justified by the communist threat and keeping up with the Soviets and everything. But when that collapsed, well, the Bolsheviks. I mean, Karl Marx had predicted, that communism would bury capitalism, and communism collapses in a screaming heap. And so, one way or another, there's a crisis of confidence with communism and Jewish Bolshevism. So, not to be deterred, I think that the Bolsheviks just simply turned to a new boogeyman to try to keep people in the synagogues and contributing. So they just invented this. They just resurrected Hitler and invented this idea of the neo-Nazi, which had some kind of vague kind of relationship to Nazis in Argentina in the 70s. The neo-Nazis of the 90s were basically a Hollywood creation, and it was attended by all these staged mass shootings and calls for gun reform, shrill calls for gun reform. And yeah, once the gun laws were passed, suddenly there were no more shootings. But anyway, but the thing is, they were vigorously hunting, neo-Nazis like the Michigan militia or something, right up until 2001, 9/11, 2001. And suddenly the Arabs and Arab terrorism and nefarious, invisible, insidious, omnipresent Arab terrorism, Muslim terrorism became the boogeyman du jour. And that,